What's up, Poker YouTube? Welcome back to another How to Beat Live Low Stakes Poker video. Today's topic, leading into the aggressor. So this is admittedly a rarer situation, but it is a topic that we should talk about, how to do it properly, when to actually do it, because a lot of players will refer to a lead as a donk bet, and that's because it's commonly known for a long time that it's supposed to be a bad bet, or like a donkey or fish makes the bet. In theory, if you know anything about poker theory, if you've worked with a solver before, or if you just understand nut and range advantage, then you'll know that leading can be a thing. And PLO, it's a thing actually quite often because the equities just run a little closer together. But in no limit, I'll give you two examples where I think it can be pretty common. One is, let's say you have a player that raises in early position or under the gun, and in live low stakes games where there seems to be a ton of players that they'll limp a lot of their range, but then they'll raise like the very top of their range. Maybe it could be anywhere from 5 to 12% of hands. When they raise, especially from early position, you will likely know that they shouldn't have a ton of like middling to smaller ranking cards in their range. And that's actually even true for most good players, I would say, that are playing like a standard range. I think we should have some middling to lighter combos in there at least some of the time, just so you can have them and not get run over in these spots by the rare good players. But let's say a player that's pretty ABC or pretty typical, like 1-2 or 1-3 or 2-5 reg, raises under the gun, and it gets folded all the way to you in the big blind, and it's a reasonable size in. Let's say that your calling range there can have some smaller to middle ranking types of cards. And let's say the flop comes something like 6-5-4 with two-tone with a suit. That is a spot where I see a lot of players in the big blind that are out of position, that aren't the aggressor, just auto check to the pre-flop aggressor because they think that's what the right thing to do is. And they're right the vast majority of the time. But if you think about this spot, who has a clear nut advantage here, especially if you guys are playing with stacks that are deeper than standard? It's going to be the player that's in the big blind because he can have all the two pairs plus that his opponent very likely doesn't have. Think about it, 6-5-4. If your opponent doesn't have pocket sixes, pocket fives, those are in his limping range maybe, or maybe he folds those pre. 8-7 for the straight. If he doesn't have those, if his best hands are the overpairs, those one pair hands, it is mandatory, in my opinion, to act aggressively as early as possible. You want to make your opponent play 3 streets of poker if you can, because over multiple streets, the polarity or the nut advantage is going to come to fruition, and that's going to be in the big blind's favor. So if I'm ever in that spot, I will lead into the pre-flop aggressor, and I don't have to have those made hands. I can have a vast majority of different kinds of hands where I'm bluffing with, can have gutters, open-enders, really anything. And like if I think my opponent is quite tight and I know that they only can have an overpair at best, then you really could argue you could do it with anything. But you have to be careful, as you guys know that are likely subscribed to this channel or watching this video and you play a good amount of live low-stakes poker, you can run into opponents who will never fold a hand like pocket kings on 6-5-4, no matter how much money you have behind, no matter how many streets you bet. They're not thinking on the level that, hey, I don't have like the two pairs are better that my opponent has, so I have to be careful here. They're not thinking about that. They think they have kings. So that's something that you do have to keep in mind. But the vast majority of players will look at the 6-5-4 board and realize, maybe not just on the flop, but if they see multiple streets of aggression, they may think to themselves, okay, what does my opponent actually have here? And yeah, he probably can have like 2 pairs, sets, straights. Like this is a pretty scary spot for me. So that is a spot where when you have a nut advantage like that, you can start betting. You might not have the range advantage, but you have a nut advantage, which means that you can act aggressively, and you can act aggressively with larger sizings as well. It might not have to start out on the flop, but as you start to progress through the hand, that might be a spot where, let's say I lead, let's just throw out kind of something, I don't know, not as arbitrary, but let's say like 50% or like half pot on the flop, and then my opponent calls, and let's say 6-5-4, let's say it's a deuce on the turn. I mean, that's a spot where you arguably could just go all in because your opponent just can't have the nutty combos you have. But if you have like enough money behind, you don't have to go all in. Like you could bet pot, you can bet more than the pot. It's just an example where the nut advantage is so pivotal to understand, and it allows you to put in large sizings like that. The other spot, this shouldn't come up as often, especially if you are a subscriber of Arch City Poker, because we don't really like to do a lot of cold calling, especially out of the small blind. But let's say action gets folded around to the button in hand number 2 here, and the button raises, and let's say it's like something smaller, like more standard you would see online, like let's say it's a 1-2 game and he makes it 5. If you're in the small blind and you're playing in a game where the rake structure isn't that bad, and so there is an argument to make some calls, you are going to show up with a tighter range, though, if you're playing proper. Like, if you're not going to call too wide out of the small blind, even if it is a smaller sizing in theory. So you'll show up with like some good pocket pairs and then some broadways that you decide not to 3-bet. So if you do get kind of a Broadway heavy board, you would think that that's really nice for the pre-flop aggressor. The thing is, players will over c-bet in spots like this when they're check 2 on the button, and they don't realize that their range is far different on the button than it is in hand 1 where they're under the gun. Your button range should be quite a bit wider than what it is under the gun, to where the Broadway heavy texture, your gun range is going to be pretty Broadway heavy. And so you're going to be able to act more aggressively more often on that in that situation. But if you're on the button and you're really wide, that's a spot where the small blind can actually lead into the button aggressor, because his range is actually a little bit narrower, and he has the advantage there because he has like a lot of Broadway heavy types of combos in his range, because he's not going to be calling as wide out of the small blind as the button is raising, if that makes sense. So those are 2 scenarios. The second one is not as common, because I would just tell my subscribers, my students, that we're just going to 3-bet in that spot, especially in most rooms where there's, especially if it's a casino and it's pretty poor rake structure. We have to 3-bet or fold pretty much in almost all these spots. But the common one is if you do have a scenario where you are closing the action in the big blind, though, and you think it's a scenario where 3-bet doesn't work as well as maybe call, and you think you can just outplay your opponent, there's an opportunity to win, to stack an opponent when you guys are effectively deep, and you do have some of those middling to lighter cards in your range, then that is a spot where you can start leading into your opponents on those lighter textures more often. Because if you don't, you'll check, and then you're allowing your opponent to play a little too perfectly. Like, maybe they get to check back, and now they make it a 2-street game, and they get to use their position to over-realize their equity and to make you kind of under-realize yours. So you want to start acting more aggressively in this spot, and you can force your opponents to under-realize their equity a little bit more often. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and let me know. Of course, as usual, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and visit us over at archcitypoker.com, where you will get more insight like this. See you guys in the next video. Thanks.